Well, hello and welcome to the Rugby Ruckus, a special podcast edition. Ben Kimber coming to you from the non-locked down Sydney. I've been wondering about what's going on in SANZAAR. We see a lot of news coming from around the world, so I thought I'd get on a couple of guys who know exactly what they're talking about from the parts of the world that really matter to Australian rugby right now. Now, we did kick the show off a minute ago and I completely stuffed up Sim's name, but I've got Sim and Jim here. I'm going to introduce them quickly. Simnikiwe Xanbanise and Jim Kayes from New Zealand. Sim from Joburg. Jim's in Auckland. Sim, how'd I go on your name that time, mate?
It was okay, except for the click. The click is very simple. It's a bit like riding a horse.
Give me the full name.
When you're riding a horse and you're trying to get it to, to giddy up, as it were, you just basically go. So that's how you say the click. It's out of the side of your tongue. So you say Xanbanise.
There we go. Beautiful. Jim Kayes, much easier on me than you. Morgan Tuanui always gives me heaps about getting the Maori names wrong, but I've got Jim Kayes at least.
Yeah, you've got that right, mate. You haven't called me Keys, what some people do. They get them. They do that.
Fair enough. Now, boys, I got you on because we've known each other from way back in the day, back when I used to write rugby and we crossed paths. Sim's one of South Africa's most outstanding freelance journos. Jim now is the Sky Sports breakdown producer, but he's been right around the traps also in New Zealand sport. Guys, let's start with you, Sim. My premise for today's show was I've been watching the way that this is playing out in Australia. Now, Australian rugby's been in a world of hurt lately. COVID obviously didn't help, but the way that it's been playing out here, we've really seen Australian rugby sort of bouncing off New Zealand mostly. And to me, SANZAAR's been very much in the background. I've seen SANZAAR coming out and making announcements or talking about things and proven wrong soon after. The game feels very much like it's moved back into the control of the independent unions. And we don't know what it looks like now in the next couple of years. It's shaping up very differently. So, Sim, I want to just touch base with you first and foremost. Bit of news out of South Africa and rugby at the moment, but what's the overall way that you think the South African Rugby Union is handling this, and what are the big points touching them at the moment?
Yeah, look, I mean, I probably should start with the news from today, and the basic news from today is that rugby will finally take place in South Africa, post-COVID, which is next weekend, the Saturday, September the 26th. And it'll be, it's what used to be called the Marvel sort of superheroes week, but it's now called the Vodacom Superfan Saturday. So, the marketers have been busy. So that's, finally we're getting started, and it's immediately going to be followed by our own version of the North versus South that so captivated the world, that happened in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago. And so essentially, it's also going to double up as trials for South Africa because, obviously I know there's big talk about whether the Springboks are going to make it to Rugby Championship. What's really going to happen is what really needs to happen is we do need to play because like every other rugby union in the world, we need the money to play. It doesn't matter who you are. And so obviously there's no more spots on the 8 nations. That basically means, obviously there's an open spot in Rugby Championship. So it's either that or whatever other independent plan. There are talks about other sort of competitions, possibly for the Springboks. But basically what's going to happen is we getting started. First, it's this Super Fan Saturday, which is next weekend, featuring all 4 Super Rugby teams. And then obviously it'll feature this trial, which features the green and the gold teams. I think up to sort of 30 players each. And they basically, they said it's going to be, they said that, Rassie Erasmus and Jacques Nienaber are going to have a whole draft thing. I'm pretty sure they've discussed to a point which players exactly are going to make which side of those 2 teams. And then after that, we're going to have our domestic rugby, which strangely enough is going to feature both competitions, Super Rugby and what used to be the Currie Cup. So you are going to have a very strange competition where if you are the 2 Super Rugby sides play against each other, you're going to get points for Super Rugby and you're going to get points for the Currie Cup. And as it goes along, and so obviously as soon as the Super Rugby sides are finished, what's going to happen next is that's going to be decided pretty much the same way it was decided in New Zealand, i.e. By log points. and then they'll carry on the Currie Cup. Currie Cup, the final, I think, is scheduled for January the 23rd. The beginning of the competition is October the 10th. So the good news is we're starting. And the even better news for Rugby Championship, for anyone who's listened to South Africa saying, we're not sure if we're going to make it because of the travel restrictions. The really good news there is the president of South Africa today, literally about 2 hours ago, said international travel will be allowed to certain places, that, that are not banned. I imagine the United States is banned because they still don't know that there is COVID. But I imagine I imagine the stars of COVID, throughout the pandemic, New Zealand, are a free place to go to. And which is why I'm very surprised that you Aussies won't go there for that October the 10th game. But that's a story for another day, right? Anyway, that's it from me.
Sim, it sounds like politics in South Africa is much more aligned with what rugby's trying to achieve there, Jim. It doesn't seem to be the case as much coming out of New Zealand. I'd say from outside, though, you look like you've had a very successful domestic approach so far with the domestic Super Rugby comp into the North-South game. How do you rate the way they've been travelling now, Jim, particularly with the political oversight?
Look, I think one of the things that's been obvious from losing the Rugby Championship to Australia, a little bit like when we lost the 2003 World Cup hosting rights to Australia, we just couldn't get our rugby and political ducks lined up. And our government's been very strong in and around quarantine, and they weren't prepared to budge. Now, this is the interesting thing. We now know they weren't prepared to budge for South Africa and particularly for Argentina. 6 of the Pumas players have got COVID. Their coach has got COVID. So there was a very strict quarantine regulations, rules in place for those 2 countries coming in. Less so for the Wallabies now that it's just you guys coming over for those 2 test matches. Maybe also a bit of political expedience there too, because I think considerable pressure went on the government when it emerged that we'd lost the hosting rights to our good mates across the ditch. And so they've loosened it a little bit for the Wallabies. So, yeah, it's been tough. We had a really good Super Rugby Aotearoa up until the final week when, the Blues were about to smash the Crusaders at Eden Park, and that got called out. He says, hand on heart.
Did I say Jim's in Auckland? Did I say Jim's in Auckland? I think I did, didn't I?
Yeah, no, you did. So, yeah, look, it's tough. No one knows, really what to do and how to predict the future, don't they? I talked to Mark Robinson a couple of weeks ago about something, and I said, mate, what do you think's going to happen with whatever it was, Bledisloe or Rugby Championship? And he said to me, mate, all I can tell you is that this coming weekend we're going to have the North and South game. Everything beyond that is a hope. And I thought that really summed up where we all are at the moment. No one really knows what the next 2 weeks are going to produce, let alone, there's a lot of talk. Sir John Kerwin, who's on The Breakdown, the show that I produced, he doesn't think the Rugby Championship will go ahead. He doesn't think Argentina will be able to field a team because of COVID. So, who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. Jim, it's interesting you say hope, because right now the difficulty Australian rugby is in is that they don't have a broadcaster for next year. Like, they've got dollars that run, towards Christmas here, and then who knows what's happening next year. So they're out there trying to sell a package right now, and that's got to be a difficult thing. We think it looks like this. We think it looks like probably another domestic Super Rugby competition next year with potentially a Super 8 or something after that, and then maybe into a 2022 Trans-Tasman comp. Sim, what does that do in South Africa when you hear those kinds of noises come out of here, particularly with the lens of, one of the ongoing themes in SANZAAR for the last few years has been the increasing connection of South Africa rugby to the Northern Hemisphere. It keeps popping up at test level, particularly though at Super Rugby provincial level. One of the things I've also said with Morgan on the podcast as we go along is that we see that the crisis is opportunity as well. There's a lot of things that Australian rugby's been getting wrong for a long time, and having to rip the playbook up and go again means that we're potentially seeing things that they get right that they weren't brave enough to do before. What's that lens look like on South Africa, particularly with that Northern Hemisphere connection and where the SANZAARs that go in future?
Well, I think essentially the first thing we need to consider is the fact that COVID-19 has ripped up so many of the sort of the well-written scripts that we that we thought we had, and And I think when you combine that with the fact that World Rugby would love to have a global season, I mean, we've been talking about this for almost 20 years now. I think we finally at that place where, we've got a perfect storm, a little bit sort of frog marched into it, but we've got the perfect storm where people can actually make different decisions simply because, the circumstances demand that, it happens that way. So you talk about, Pro 14 / Pro 16. It's essentially, I mean, it's become an open secret in South Africa that, basically with the declaration out of New Zealand that, there would no longer be, Super Rugby as we know it. It then sort of made it permissible for us to talk about Pro 14 rugby, which actually is Pro 16, simply because what's going to happen is they're going to take the 4 Super Rugby sides and add them on to the to the old Pro 12, and then they're going to take the 2 sort of underperforming teams from Pro 14, and basically the Kings. What's happened there is South African Rugby has taken back the franchise, so there's no. They decide what happens there. But obviously the Cheetahs now, that could be a legal issue because they've got a couple of years left in Pro 14 and they haven't really done anything wrong. And they've just gone on a shopping spree to actually be competitive in Pro 14. And now they're going to find out that they're no longer, going to play in that competition. And if that happens, then, it's probably going to be, a legal issue brewing in the background, and they're probably going to have to find the Cheetahs another competition to go to, a bit like they did with Pro 14. But it does sound like, that there will be an emigration, but the big question mark is whether the Springboks will follow suit. And it's strange from what I can hear from it, what sort of SA Rugby probably would like, and this is speculation, and so, don't take it as gospel. They would like to go Pro 14 in terms of the franchises, but actually they'd like to stay in the Rugby Championship because that's, they make a fair bit of money there. And I think it's, with Rugby Championship, it sounds great to say, yeah, we're going to go up north because, there's no jet lag, there's no this, there's no that, the flights are shorter, it's much kinder to the players, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the real big issue there is when you look at who's won World Cups over the years, there's only one Northern Hemisphere side that's ever done it. That's got to have something to do with the intensity of the rugby down here. So I don't think South Africa want to give it up, give everything up, on the playing side. And I suspect actually, funnily enough, on the financial side as well. And so it's that tricky sort of position that, that South Africa finds itself in. But you won't hear any of this being said anywhere, simply because there are legal and binding contracts in place at the moment as we speak. Super Rugby, the next 5 years of Super Rugby hasn't even started. And we're talking about Pro 16 or Pro 14 or whatever it is. And so, nobody's going to say that because they would get themselves, liable to all kinds of legal recourse, as it were.
I think Sim makes a really interesting point, and Steve Hansen used to talk about, he was adamant that New Zealand and South Africa had to stay in Super Rugby competition because he saw playing the South African teams in Super Rugby and the travel involved as crucial to conditioning the All Blacks for Test rugby. So he was absolutely adamant that South Africa had to be involved in Super Rugby because of that next level. And he also was adamant that the Springboks had to be involved because, as you say, Sim, I mean, if you look at the World Cups, we've dominated them, the Southern Hemisphere. It's interesting when you ask Ben about the future of SANZAAR. I mean, like you guys, I've been writing about it since it started. And almost since it started, people were saying SANZAAR's doomed and it's going to split and South Africa's going to bugger off and, they don't want to play, they're traveling too much and all of that sort of stuff. Mate, this is rinse and repeat material, isn't it? We could all drag out of the archives 100 stories that we've written about this, It's the beast that you can't kill. It's a snake with 70,000 heads. Who knows? I mean, at the moment, you would say that next year, Super Rugby is going to look very different, right? Because of COVID and that stuff. But after that, I don't know. I hope that they use this as an opportunity to reduce the competition. I know that you guys in Australia, Ben, don't want to hear this, But the Super Rugby competition was best when there were 3 Australian teams and probably 4 South African teams. And that's when, you think back to Super 12.
So the Kiwis stay, mate? You keep all your Kiwi teams?
Look at Super Rugby, mate. Look at who's won it. Look at the history of it. And when was it best? When the Brumbies were strong, when the Waratahs were strong, and when the Reds were strong. And we want decent games. I want the Blues to go to Canberra and be thinking, man, if these guys don't play well, they're going to get smacked. And history says that in the last 3 or 4 years, we've been going over to Australia and picking up win after win after win. And it's boring.
You can't challenge that.
You can't. We want a really tough competition where if the Stormers come here, they're going to give the Crusaders a beating. Now that's not happening now. We want a tough competition. All 3 of us do, don't we?
We do.
And of course, the great irony is that Super Rugby next year was poised to go back to Super 14. Which was probably the last time the competition was actually a decent competition.
Yeah.
It was going to go back to exactly what it should have gone back to, and then literally all hell broke loose. And it'll be quite interesting to see how sort of things are patched up. You talk about a global season. I suspect the global season still makes more sense if you play people that are sort of geographically close to each other, as opposed to just throwing people together, because the sense I get from up north in terms of the Six Nations, they're not interested in having the Springboks in the Six Nations
There's no way walking up there and beating them. I mean, it's the last. They want, let's bring in a team that's going to beat us four times out of 5. I mean, the Poms will be absolutely crapping themselves over that, let alone the Scots and the Italians. I mean, I just look at that and think this is sensible stuff. If you're the coach of those teams, you're going, actually, hang on a sec. I quite like winning Six Nations. The last thing we need is a rampant Springbok team to come in here. And the global season, again, God, we've been writing about this for decades.
Yeah.
You've got to get those British clubs to move. Now, there's more chance of Donald Trump talking sense than getting the British clubs to move. It's just not going to happen. Not going to happen.
But this is where, like, we're seeing the stories come up around the world now about private equity, right? CVC buying up different areas. And surely one of the reasons that's attractive is because rugby has it so wrong. We've all talked about it for so long around how the global alignment would actually drive so much more engagement and such a better structure across the game that the value would be unlocked. Surely these private equity guys are seeing that. But I just want to touch on, Jim, you said Super Rugby was best back in the day, and it was. The question for me, and we have a different sporting landscape in Australia, right? It's such a competitive landscape. One of the reasons that the opportunity that I've seen is that I absolutely love having the South African teams in, right? You guys know I've been there since day one watching this comp, and I love the differences in the teams. I love what the South African teams bring. But in terms of the product that Super Rugby is in the Australian market, in an increasingly competitive Australian market where it's dog eat dog, we've seen the AFL and the NRL grow here, do better with the juniors, and no question that Rugby Australia, or the ARU as it was then, hasn't done a great job of consolidating the opportunities it had from 2003 onwards, and it's been under pressure. One of the reasons I've liked the look of a Trans-Tasman comp, and I've liked the look of the next couple of years, is putting aside for a minute if we get touched up, Australian rugby has to be better on the field. Having a product which is 100% in our time zone, not just for the broadcast value it would bring, but for the connection to the rugby community that would bring. The fans in Australia have, as the teams haven't performed well, you're getting 2-3 games in our time zone where they're getting touched up, and then they're off in South Africa or somewhere else. It hasn't been a great product, and I hate to put it that way because it doesn't start as a product for guys who enjoy their rugby. But the opportunity to build something which means more in our market, but I'd love to keep the South African connection, but does it make commercial sense for us to have it is a really important part. So what about that commercial lens? I'll go to you first, Sim. Did I read that there's some private equity sniffing around in South African rugby? And where's the money? What's the oversight for South African rugby?
Well, first things first, the money is obviously horrendous simply because of COVID-19. If you SA Rugby, your team against all odds, really. And I know some people will say they knew we were going to win last year. That's not necessarily true. Against all odds, you win the World Cup. and you're expecting a year in which you're going to cash in, and this happens. This whole COVID-19 thing happens. But what had happened before that, you speak about CVC Capital Partners. They had reached out to SA Rugby about actually, getting a stake in, in SA Rugby, and those talks, as far as I understand, are still ongoing. And the last person who kind of this is the top secret in South African rugby, the talks with CVC Capital Partners. The last I heard of the talks was that those guys needed to come in and actually evaluate South African rugby sort of almost in person. Just have a look at the buildings, have a look at what they're buying into. But that's a story for another day. But having looked at them spending 120 million quid, I think it was, on Pro 14, it looks very promising for South Africa if you look at it from that perspective. But in terms of the game in South Africa at the moment, when COVID-19 broke, I think these guys budgeted to save something like 700 million to R1 billion in terms of cutting costs. So if you put that together, you've got a game that's got a massive hole where its bank account should be.
What sort of percentage would that be, Sim? Is that what sort of chunk of overall budget would that be? Is that...
I'll be honest. I don't know what kind of percentage that is, but I mean, it can't be much less than, it can't be less than 50% to start with. Wow. I mean, the talk at the time was that they had pinned the 31st of December as basically doomsday if they didn't get any rugby done. So that's why today was such a good day, because they will get rugby, played, which then basically means they can start making money again. They're probably living on bank overdrafts. And look, I mean, I imagine absolutely everyone is basically living on the bare minimum, the world over. So it's not just a South African problem, but that talks, the talks with CVC Capital Partners is a very, is very promising talks. And there are sort of more and more private equity companies that are trying to get into the franchises, which is really where the problems in South Africa tend to be, simply because poor SA Rugby, has to bankroll, absolutely everyone. I mean, I know it happens in New Zealand, which is it's much more standardized, and basically it's been that way for forever. In South Africa, everyone likes to act as if that's not really the case, but when it comes down to it, when it comes down to putting out, SA Rugby cannot get any kind of programs off the ground simply because they have to sustain a good 14 provincial unions, which is obviously gonna sap the old bank account. And I think to hear that there's a lot of companies that are trying to get involved. We've got, I think it's MVM Holdings from New York trying to get into the Stormers, and the Bulls are already being bankrolled by two of our billionaires, which basically means they fine for money. You saw how many players they've bought during COVID. Nobody should be buying players during that time, but those guys have bought literally about 20 players. So essentially it does look like, if we could, just get to the end of the year without too many dramas, it might actually be a decent period for South African rugby going forward. But obviously those deals have to be made. And if those deals are not made, geez, the game is in trouble.
Ben, you were almost apologising for calling rugby a product, but I think you're spot on. And rugby administrators, they need to shift away from thinking of themselves as a sport and thinking of themselves at that top level as entertainment, because they're chasing the same entertainment dollars. It's the same money that we could spend going to a concert, going to a movie, going to the theatre, whatever it is that spins your wheels. That's the money that they're chasing. And if they can think a little bit more like that and think that they're chasing that money, and therefore their product has to be something that you want to go and see, and add into that stadium organisers, stadium owners and those sorts of things, then the game will start to, I think, flourish, because no one wants to go and see a boring game of rugby. 6-3 was okay in 1963, but it's not okay now. We want to see big hits, tries, spectacular players, athletes, and that's what the game is. Administrators need to wake up to that. They need to realise the dollar that they're chasing, and add to that, the blooming athlete needs to get better at promoting the game as well. But we see it here.
Mate, spot on.
mate, with the NRL, I just smile every time anyone from rugby league talks, because they are all about promoting the game. The talk ahead state of origin match is wonderful, and yet we get these boring answers from rugby players when really they need to be thinking that they've got to promote the game. Yeah. If Ben Coles is coming up against Cody Taylor, I want to hear him say, mate, that guy's chasing my jersey, and I'm going to try and knock him off the park. Instead, we've got to be a tough game.
Really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to this game, and you didn't never take a South African team lightly.
I'll give you a great example. So after Steve Hansen said Sonny Bill Williams was, the greatest athlete he's ever coached, the best athlete he's ever coached.
Sorry, mate, I just nodded off this. You said Sonny Bill Williams, I think, yeah.
So I tried to sort of replicate that story, and with return to play coming closer and closer, I thought it would be a really nice idea to speak to the 4 franchise coaches. So I sent out an email to the comms people of each franchise, and basically the response I got was, "Oh no, they loath to single out one athlete in favor of the others." And basically what that did was it basically it put blood in the water for the others, and the others were like, yeah, what he said, and guess what? No more story, gone completely.
Yeah.
And it was a nothing story. It was just let's just have a quick, what do you guys think, and just turned it down.
I had Eddie Jones on the podcast about 2 or 3 months ago now, and we were talking about the difference. Like, famously Eddie was really hard on players. I assume he still is to a certain extent, but he used to just rip them. But there are guys today who say he ripped the hell out of me, but I'm a better man for it. And you will find guys who go, my God, I never want to speak about that man again, right? There were some different camps. But he made the point to me that he said he can't operate the way he used to, not just because he realised he needed to get better at things, but he said the players today, he said, they're a different breed. He said if you go hard on them, they don't have the resilience. He actually said he sees it in results too. He don't think teams are as resilient anymore because the players aren't. If they go down by, you don't see comebacks like you used to. He said, and he has to treat them differently. But Jim, I think you're spot on in selling it, and that was part of my position around, a better, more visible product in Australia. That's got to be part of it. I do want to just get a little bit more into the health of the game, though, Jim. I see stories coming out of New Zealand Rugby, and I see that they sold part of their product to the broadcaster, to Sky. So Sky actually has a stake in the game over there now. Is the game healthy in New Zealand? I'll go to you first, Jim. Like, crowds were down in Super Rugby, surely. Ratings, I'm not sure. Money. Has the game been healthy, or has it needed something to change?
I think the game overall has seen a reduction in interest and in players right the way through. And there's a whole heap of reasons for that, eh? Mum doesn't want to see little Johnny getting beaten up and knocked out, concussion, those sorts of things at the grassroots. There's a lot of other things that you can do now in terms of sport, triathlons, mountain biking, paddling, well, you name it, there's things that you can do. So there's competition for it there. So we have seen a reduction in numbers, but I was really encouraged by Super Rugby Aotearoa and the enthusiasm of people getting along to the games. I went to a couple of the Blues games. I actually paid for my tickets. Oh, it hurts to say that.
I know. You're probably wearing Auckland Blues shorts and socks at the moment, mate. They give you your kit, your clothes, I reckon.
For 30 years, and you finally stump up and pay for a ticket and you go along with the crowd. No, but it was so we were seeing big numbers coming back, and that was good. Part of that was because we'd had nothing to do for so long. So the health of the game, I think it's really in the balance, and I think what they decide to do over the next 12 months is a big part of that. People were bored by Super Rugby, absolutely bored. They weren't turning up. They weren't watching it on telly. They've got to get whatever the product is right. And as Sim said earlier, COVID has ripped everything up. So we've got a new blank piece of paper, and they cannot afford to stuff it up. whatever they decide, if it's with South Africa, with Australia, with whoever, Argentina, Japan, there's a lot of talk about a Pacific Islands team, which is long overdue. Whatever they do, they've got to get it right. And it's got to be competitive. We want this competition to be competitive. You know, you talk about rugby at an international level. What have we got, fellas? Probably 8 or 9 teams that compete at the most. You know, there's New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia. And then you've got the Poms, you've got the Irish, the Welsh, the French on their day. And that's really it, eh? I mean, outside of that, there's not a team that's going to knock over one of those teams consistently. Or Argentina as well, maybe. So we need competition. So whatever they decide, if it's not competitive, people won't come along and watch it. It's got to be attractive and it's got to be competitive.
Pre-COVID, Sim.
Yeah.
I was going to say, pre-COVID, was the game in South Africa healthy? Was it a World Cup aside, which everyone loves as a big boost? Was the game healthy and travelling well pre-COVID?
Look, I think South Africa is probably a slightly different beast in terms of it's SANZAAR partners, because we get off on momentum. If you look at all our big wins, 95 was because the teams had done well in Super 10. 2007.
95 just been cancelled.
No, not yet. 07, obviously, because of the first, Super Rugby win, by the Bulls the same year. And if you look at last year, Rugby Championship win leading into it, because we hadn't done anything. So I think South Africans were actually looking forward to what our franchises would do. But the simple truth is, it doesn't matter how much you want to look forward to it. Jim talks about the competition in terms of, we want a competition that's captivating. You cannot be captivated if your day of rugby begins at 5 a.m. That's what happens in South Africa. It begins at 5 a.m. in South Africa, and it could finish at 2 a.m. the next day. There's no way anybody has that much appetite for rugby. So we were watching too much rugby, because for years, all the rights holders did, when they were asked by the broadcasters, right then, guys, what are you going to do for this new batch of money that we're going to give you? All the guys said was, we're going to give you more games, which basically means more eyeballs. And in the end, we just had too many games. So I think South Africa was kind of like in roughly the same sort of position. But South Africa is probably more sort of balanced in terms of its main sort of sporting codes. We are very much a football, cricket, and rugby nation. And we don't quite, we don't get as easily diluted, if I should call it that, in terms of, a game by other sort of interest. Although we probably don't get as many people at stadiums like everybody else doesn't, simply for the same reasons. The kids are into stuff that's totally different at the moment. I think the only stadium that can still hold its own in terms of any stadium in the world, in terms of bringing people in, is Newlands. And of course, they're closing that up. I imagine it'll move on to Cape Town Stadium, next year. But what I'm saying is, the only franchise that repeatedly gets people to come through its gates, sort of the right kind of people, the right number of people, is the Stormers. But even that, you have to wonder how much, how long can it last? This MVM holdings deal that I was talking about, it's about 100 million rand, which is a lot of money, by our standards. And the guys that run the Stormers are not interested, because they would lose control. And it's basically saying, we are afraid we'd lose control over something we don't really have control over, because we're in debt. When you're in debt, you don't have any control. So you need to stop talking about, you need to stop talking about control, because you already, haven't got, if you owe more.
You've got a master, you've got a different master. Yeah,
exactly. So I just, it probably was healthy, almost from a nostalgic or sentimental, that's probably the right word to say it, than it was in terms of, sort of hard rands and cents.
Sima, it's really interesting, because I think you touched on it there. I think the nostalgia for the game in Australia is still there, and there's still the rush that on people. But it's that transient fan that Australia has definitely lost, that they're trying to bring back. You also talked about there, the different master of having, owing money, etc. is part of the problem, boys. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to get you on to start with. I want to talk about SANZAAR because, Jim, we have been talking about it forever. You know, is it real? You know, does the structure work, etc. But to me, the last few months, they've really looked like a straw man to me, SANZAAR. I said, you know, can you have a genuine competition where you have a faux leadership organisation? For me, that, like, they're invisible. They barely ever come out and say anything, and when they do, it's a press release longer than, you know, War and Peace, and then the organisations, the Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, will come out and say what they think anyway. So how does SANZAAR continue to exist? What should it look like, Jim? Is SANZAAR, what is it? Tell me what it is.
Well, Andy Marinos, I think he's just a name on a press release, isn't he? I mean, it's run by New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia. Let's be honest about that. And they'll do, you know, and it's that collaborative, sort of cooperative type of thing. And so will they continue to exist? Look, I think that in the best interest of the game in this part of the world, they will, because as we've sort of highlighted over the last half hour or so, we need each other. As much as there's talk of South Africa going north and a trans-Tasman competition, that sort of thing, there is a real on the field, there's a need to keep playing each other. You know, we need Australian rugby to be strong, which is why we've given you Dave Rennie. We need to play.
You wanted him.
We need to keep playing the Springboks and the South Africans, because they're a different style of rugby to what we'd get otherwise, you know. So I think that they'll probably hang tough in there. But the next couple of months will be interesting. I mean, I'm really interested in your thoughts, Tim. Do you think South Africa will turn up and play in the Rugby Championship? Do you think there's enough time for them to become competitive? Because the big concern I'd have if I was Rassie Erasmus is that you're going to turn up undercooked and get smacked, and there's no benefit in that for the world champions.
New Zealand won't want you to train too much, mate. They'd like to keep you in quarantine and split up a little bit so that you don't turn up ready to go.
Yeah. For 2 weeks. Jim, the short answer to your question is no. There won't be, you know, they won't be, yes, they'll turn up in all likelihood. I see them turning up because I think developments from today saying that international travel was possible suggests to me hints that, you know, they may turn up, but they're very reluctant. From what I understand, they're very reluctant because of exactly the same reasons that you've just mentioned. Jacques Nienaber, the new South African, you know, Springbok coach, you have to look at it from his perspective. He's never been a head coach anywhere before. So when he was announced, he was announced, you know, by his friend as the new coach. So already, you know, alarm bells are going off there in terms of, hang on, wait, this guy's, you know, has gotten the job through his friend. And the second bit is he's never been a head coach anywhere. Look, if you talk to anyone within the Springbok setup, don't worry. That's the right guy for the job. That's exactly the right guy for the job. And if South Africa wants to, you know, to carry on down a very consistent path, they are going to need to use, you know, what they've got. The system that they've got in place is the right system. But, you know, he was supposed to play his first test, in July. It hasn't happened yet. And by the time he does, his players will, in all likelihood, have played at most 3 games, because they'll play on September the 26th, play on October the 3rd, and then October the 10th, which is the beginning of the domestic competition, at which time they'll have to go into camp before they depart and before they get quarantined to within an inch of their lives. Jacques had worked out that, having watched Aotearoa and Super Rugby AU, he'd worked out that you need 6 weeks or 6 games to basically get back, you know, to shake all the rest off. It's not going to happen. In all likelihood, they're only going to get 3 games. And actually, some of those players are not going to get, you know, 3 games, because the Stormers, I think, have a bye on the first round of the domestic competition. So
thanks very much.
and if you look at the Stormers, you look at that forward pack, which includes obviously the captain Stephen Kitsoff, Bongi Monambi, Frans Malherbert. You put all those boys together, that's a huge part of the Springbok team, and they won't have played. So they're very reluctant to do it, because they feel like they've worked so hard, to win the World Cup, and secondly, to get that ranking, having come from 7th, I think it was when Rassie Erasmus took over. They've worked so hard to get there that it's just basically going to, it's all going to dissipate, and it's all going to be through no fault of their own. And they've actually, for once in South Africa, the reason South Africa wins, the World Cup once every 12 years is because invariably we fire the coach that wins the World Cup. And for once we sat, and we said, hang on, wait, this doesn't work. Let's do the continuity thing.
It's like the way Graham Henry survived. Exactly like the way Graham Henry survived.
Yeah, even that's not going to save us. So they're not keen. But I get the impression that they don't have a choice but to come. If it's not to find to make sure that the Springboks play, because the other question is, if the Springboks don't play at the end of this year, where will they have played, or where will they play by the time they play the British?
And where's the money, Sim? And where's the money?
And that's the other question. Yeah.
I tell you what, Ben, it's going to be fascinating to see Dave Rennie go up against Ian Foster, because I get the feeling there's not a lot of love lost between those two, and we've already seen Rennie fire a few little gentle shots. The line where he said they can't believe Lachlan Boshier wasn't picked for the
I saw that.
The All Blacks. There was that a little bit of a dig at Sam Cane, and he's fired shots about we're not going to turn up and all that sort of stuff. And and he's a brilliant coach. So I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait for the build-up to the first week. That first Brisbane Cup. It's going to be great.
Actually, if we being kind to Australia, I know that Jim and I
please Jim.
If Jim and I probably speak from a position of superiority of sorts, given what our teams have done, recently. Look, in South Africa, this is a terrible thing to have to tell you, Ben, but in South Africa, the slot that was dedicated to the Australian Super Rugby sides was basically the slot at which you relented to your missus about either doing the chores around the house or basically going shopping, simply because there was nothing to watch. But I have to say. We used to call the Australian derbies basically slow burners without the burn bit.
Just gonna cop it here.
Listen. Okay, but the really good stuff is like Jim says, you've got a sensational coach in Dave Rennie, and secondly, I know that a lot of the kids that were introduced, we barely knew who some of them were, but you got some good kids there. All you've got to do is make sure that you keep them and you put them together, and we might get to a position where by the next World Cup, so Australia will be a genuine contender, not a contender based on what they've done in the past or the fact that they're always a contender at a World Cup. It'll be actually probably because of the form they've displayed going into the World Cup. I really, really, really look forward to watching Australia from here on in, especially with a guy like Dave Rennie at the helm.
Sim, we're doing our best, mate. We're trying our hardest. Look, we've given them Brad Thorne to coach the Reds to try to get them. We've given Rob Penny.
Brad Thorne was nothing without his rugby league in Australia. Nothing.
We've given them Rob Penny to look after the Waratahs. We sent a few players over there. We gave them an administrator.
He's doing a good job too.
They bladed her, and now we've given them Dave Rennie. So, what else do they want? We gave them Pro.
Listen. Thanks for Dave Rennie.
We did our bit with Dave Vessels.
Thanks for Dave Rennie, but I'll wait and see some results first before I start to wonder about how good he is. I did want to ask though, just the perception of Australian rugby, how has it changed since the Castle-Klein era into what we have now, guys? For me, we felt very meek beforehand. Not that Castle wasn't making some moves that were going to be improving Australian rugby, but as an organisation in a really tough market, we felt meek. And forget what the old story says. The meek aren't going to inherit anything in Australian sport, right? We felt like we weren't on the front foot. I think at least now we seem to have in Clark and McLennan a couple of guys who have a little bit of, if I can put it this way, a bit of the arsehole in them, like that they're not going to take a backward step, that, they're going to take on the Kiwis. They're going to tell them exactly what we want, that they're going to be out there, really hammering our interests. What's the perception, Jim, from you first of Australian rugby and the moves that they're making at the moment?
I think you're spot on. I think if you'd gone back a month ago, we were describing you guys as shambolic and all of that sort of stuff. Now you've
Which we were.
Now you print the rugby championship off New Zealand. So you know you've got to give credit to your administrators in that regard. I think that they're slowly getting their ducks in line. The thing that interests me is why Twiggy Forrest, who's got all that money and all that passion for the game, continues to be kept on the fringes. Is it because he wants too much control or something? I mean, I would have thought that for a game, for a sport that is ranked maybe 5th in Australia, but would you say, is that fair? 5th probably? That you'd be
4th, 5th, yeah, easy.
Something like that, where you'd be saying to someone like Twiggy, Andrew Forrest will bring you billions of dollars in and spend them, but you seem
the bloke
to be
has some cash, just quietly. He has some cash.
Him away. I mean, if he was wanting to invest in anything that I was involved in, mate, I'd be rolling out six rolls of red carpet, But you guys are pushing him away. It doesn't make sense.
I think that has changed. I think that has changed. But you're dead right. He's done a great job of bankrolling the force, and how lucky for Australian rugby that they were still around, and we could have a 5-team competition. That that he went out and kept them alive, and they were there. Because with a 4-team competition, that Super Rugby AU would have been half of what it is now. Just that extra 5th team and them being there. Sim, what have you seen from Australian rugby? Do you think that they look like they're making the right moves?
In a strange way, Australian rugby for me sort of mirrors world rugby. It's a game that it's a code that would love.
He's just landing punches on us all day today, isn't he, Jim?
What I'm trying to say is it's a code that that preaches growth. It's a code that talks a big game, basically, if I should put it that way. And what hasn't happened is the necessary moves to make sure that it that it does become that this big global player that it would like to be. So essentially, what I'm talking about to make the World Rugby comparison, so we did the whole go to Japan thing, and then where's Japan now? Where they're going to play? Are we gonna keep them? Are we gonna sort of bottle that? Yes, we'd love to go to America. We'd love to, to spread the game out into America, but we don't do it. And yes, there's a big fear that if rugby goes truly global, one of the things that could happen is, New Zealand could end up like Brazil, where they export, the most talent, but don't have a particularly good domestic product of their own. If you opened it up like that, and then we basically did transfer market in that. So Australian rugby strikes me as a bit, big ideas, but no one to follow through. But the messages that have come out of the new sort of regime, if I should call it that. There's a lot of hard talk where, at first, I think it was McLennan said, look, we basically not going to come into, to agree with what New Zealand have to say. And a guy like Dave Rennie saying, no, sorry, we don't do October the 10th because it just doesn't work for our team. So that's exactly what Australia needs. It needs to sort of, it needs to have an idea of how it's going to sort of, conquer the world, as it were, instead of, just talking about it. And I think, these are the first parts. It's going to, at the moment, it comes across as a bit rude because obviously everyone listens to New Zealand. But, the more they sort of, they're going to grow in, they're going to grow into that. Well, we all listen to that.
That's an interesting comment, because in New Zealand, we see our rugby administrators on a global stage, as being weak, as being ineffective. We haven't been able to achieve any of the things that New Zealand wanted to do. We wanted to allow Pacific players to the second tier to re-qualify internationally. So if you'd played for Australia or New Zealand, after a stand-down period, you could play for Samoa, Tonga, Fiji. That didn't happen because of the Poms and the Welsh that were scared of it. We don't see our leaders as being anywhere near effective on an international stage as they should be. We always joke here that the All Blacks are regarded as the best team in the world, but our leaders are regarded as, I don't know, Romania. thing, you know.
Look,
Mate, like the last month or so, I've said it a few times. I've thought New Zealand has come across as arrogant. I thought maybe arrogant's not the right word, but definitely not looking at the game more broadly, right? And just trying to make decisions and thinking everyone else would fall in the line, thinking Australia would fall in the line with what they wanted to do. They certainly have seemed to me to be naive, if not arrogant, Jimmy, if I could put it that way, that they can pull strings that they obviously can't.
Look, I would say regionally, definitely New Zealand is probably the big brother of all of us in terms of where, in terms of how their team plays. I think financially it's quite murky, obviously, with the kind of money that South Africa brings into it. But globally, I think Jim's 100% right. They're not as strong as they should be, given what their team can do, on a weekly basis. But it's one of those things. New Zealand, I don't know. I've never met an arrogant New Zealander, so maybe that's where the problem is.
Don't worry about that.
boys, we're going to have to start wrapping it up. I could talk to you guys all day. It's been absolutely fantastic to catch up. Just give me quickly before we go, Jim, I'll go to you first and then Sim. Give me what you think the next year or two. What would the best sort of structure look like for New Zealand rugby, Jim, and what do you think will actually happen?
Look, this is under the belief that COVID's going to hang around and it's going to continue to affect international travel. So within that, I think next year will probably be some sort at some stage of a Trans-Tasman Super Rugby competition. It might be that we play ours, you play yours, and then we come together for some sort of a finals thing. So for next year, I think they'd struggle to bring South Africa back into it purely because of the travel and because of COVID and that sort of stuff. Beyond that, I hope that we see a return to a competition that still involves South Africa, still involves Australia, has a team from the Pacific, and is maybe 14. 14 would be the most that I'd want to see in there. I think for a competition to have integrity, we all have to play each other. So I don't like this conference stuff because,
no, God, no.
South Africa and beating the Bulls at Pretoria, that's what it's all about. If you can do that, then you've got some kudos, because that's one of the toughest places that I've ever been as a spectator, let alone as a player. So I want to see a competition that is competitive, that involves our three countries, because I think that's really important. But next year, I don't think that'll happen. It'll be more of a Australia, New Zealand, some sort of a hybrid playoff competition type of thing.
Yeah. Sim, what about South Africa, mate?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, look, it's similarly tricky for South Africa, simply because I had heard talk about, Australia doing their own thing, New Zealand doing their own thing, South Africa doing their own thing, and then sort of, the top teams out of those competitions meeting, I think, over a 6-week competition to sort of, decide who's the best in the region. South Africa, I think, desperately needs that kind of competition if they are to be competitive, against the British and Irish Lions. The reason South Africa beat the Lions the last time around in 2009 was because I think they caught the Lions napping a bit in the first game, and then the second game was tight, and they were obviously, they were lucky to make that massive comeback and win the series. But I think this time around, if the Springboks, go in without a sign of a domestic competition or a competition across, with Australia and New Zealand, they'll be undercooked for that too. So that's their biggest, that's South Africa's biggest problem at the moment. And I do worry about South African teams playing up north in terms of just what it would do to the actual rugby. In terms of everything else, the money, the comfort for the players, and all of that, it's not that bad. And yes, guys will have to stomach strange things like playing through summer in playing rugby in summer in South Africa. But I just worry about the effects of playing up north when it comes to sort of the big picture. And the big picture is ultimately you want to beat New Zealand, you want to beat Australia, you want to beat all the other teams, and you don't want to sort of give the Six Nations sides too much of a look in terms of the inner workings of a Springbok side. So I think next year is going to be is going to be an even trickier balance for South African rugby. So I'm not sure what I'd actually like to see, because I'm not sure I want us to play up north. But I also understand how difficult it is for our players to, to carry on like this. But that's the other thing, though. It's been 25 years of this. It's a bit late for us to start complaining that it doesn't work in terms of, the travel, isn't it?
Guys, look, I really appreciate both your opinions, and from my perspective, what I think about Australian rugby is they're almost falling ass backwards into something that's really good for them. Like, if we can get another Super AU competition next year, rolling into a Super 8 kind of a structure where we do play the other teams, it's giving our young blokes a chance to come through. It's giving our teams a chance to get back on their feet. I think it's a good thing. And look, my preference would be, when I heard the Super 8 concept, I absolutely loved it, because my preference would be some sort of a trans-Tasman competition that then rolls up into something where we take on the likes of South Africa, etc. Because to me, that would give us that product that is here in our time zone for our kids. I've got an 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an 8-year-old, too. And they don't get up and watch the Waratahs at 3 a.m, I'll tell you that right now. But they've got NFL and AFL 100% Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday afternoon, Sunday night. It's everywhere, wall to wall. And then the Tars are, 3 home games. It doesn't work. I want to see something that we have in our time zone, but I still would love to keep that connection. Speaking of the connection, boys, it's been great to connect to you both again. Neither of you have aged a day in the last 20 years. It's amazing. You both look fantastic. Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on, mate. You look after yourself in Auckland.
Cheers, mate.
Sim, apologies for butchering your name up the front, mate. I hope you look after yourself, mate, and you should follow both of these boys on Twitter as well. They are very entertaining. Thank you, Sim.
It's all good. Thanks, man.
Cheers.
That was the Rugby Ruckus. A really enjoyable chat. We'll be back later in the week to talk more rugby. Thanks, guys.